Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you all to the Institute of World Politics this afternoon. For those of you who don't know, the Institute of World Politics is a graduate school of national security and international affairs, dedicated to teaching all of the instruments of national power in a strategically coordinated way and in a way that reflects the values of the American founding and the Western moral tradition. Very glad you could join us this afternoon for Professor David Satter's talk on Russia's stake in Ukraine. Professor Satter has been an expert on Russian affairs for more than 4 decades. He is a fellow of the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. He's also a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He's the author of several works on Russia and the Soviet Union. Age of Delirium, The Decline and Fall of the Soviet Union, which was also made into an award-winning documentary film. Also, Darkness at Dawn, The Rise of the Russian Criminal State, and the rather intriguingly titled, It Was a Long Time Ago and It Never Happened Anyway, Russia and the Communist Past. He's a former correspondent of the Chicago Tribune, the Financial Times, and the Wall Street Journal, and we're very glad to welcome Dr. David Satter. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that introduction. But I guess the pedantic side of my nature compels me to point out that I'm actually not I do not have a PhD. I'm not Dr. Satter, although long ago I gave up trying to correct people. But just for the record, I have a much more modest degree. It's called a B.Lit. This is a thesis I wrote when I was a graduate student at Oxford, and when I first really began to take an interest in Russia and to travel to Russia. As a graduate student, I went there for long periods of time during the vacations. And if we include those periods, then it is indeed more than 4 decades. However, if we limit my so-called expertise to the period when I was a designated expert, or something close to that, it's actually less than 4 decades. I hasten, when you get to a certain age, you try to point these things out. In any case, I'm very glad to be here, and I've been acquainted with John Lenchowsky, who is the director of the Institute of World Politics, and ever since he served on the National Security Council under Reagan, and he first talked to me about his idea of creating such an institute in Washington and the valuable role he thought that it could play. And in fact, as he sketched out the idea at that time, it has been realized. So I'm particularly glad to be here. I was an eyewitness to the events which have led to the present Russian-Ukrainian crisis, in part because I was in Kiev for a completely different reason. I was there to renew my visa. And I was working at that time as an advisor and contributor to Radio Liberty in Moscow. And in that capacity, I had been accredited as a foreign correspondent, as a Moscow correspondent. There were some bureaucratic problems, and I had to go and exchange one visa for another. And it was in Kiev at the time of the beginnings of the anti-criminal revolution there that I, in fact, was told that I was not going to be allowed back into Russia. And I then became actually the first correspondent expelled from Russia since the beginning of the Cold War. Now, it might seem at first that there's not much of a connection between my fate as a correspondent and what was happening on the ground in Ukraine. But in fact, as I've thought back on those events since, it occurs to me that it was specifically the ability of the Ukrainians to organize on the basis of opposition to criminal power that so unsettled the Russian authorities that they made a fundamental decision no longer to tolerate many of the things that they had previously tolerated, albeit grudgingly. Russia's long been engaged in the effort to convince the world that it's a normal country, while being at the same time, in essence, a very abnormal country. It is that pretense that has in fact allowed the Russian people a measure of freedom, and it has allowed Russia a measure of successful interaction with the outside world. But when the regime becomes threatened, that pretense becomes a luxury that it can't bear as easily anymore. I think that my expulsion was one reflection of that. Other expulsions that have followed similarly make the point. And in general, the massive anti-Western and anti-American propaganda, which is now typical for the Russian media, and a level of mendacity which even for them is unprecedented, are other indications of what has happened. And this is because the events in Ukraine are not trivial from the point of view of Russia, but on the contrary, strike at the very stability of the regime. They represent a challenge and also an opportunity. They represent a challenge to the Russian leaders, in that a way has been found to overthrow a regime which monopolizes all of the levers of power under the right circumstances. At the same time, it's an opportunity for a disenfranchised, disempowered population to defend its rights ultimately and to make a transition to a better future. The Russians we now are faced with the spectacle of Russians and Ukrainians fighting each other. Two peoples who are very closely related, have a common history, share languages which are actually fairly similar, which have large numbers of families in which there are both Ukrainian and Russian members, and who have the shared, perhaps most important, cultural experience of 73 years of communism under the Soviet Union. During the Soviet period, there was often a ranking of nationalities implicit in the way in which Soviet propaganda depicted those national groups that were playing a great role in the building of communism. And Ukrainians were always, if not first, then second after Russians. Ukrainians were always seen as the most reliable Soviet nationality, with Jews and Balts being the least. The literature of that period glorifies and idealizes Ukrainians and attributes to them all kinds of heroic virtues. The greatest Ukrainian writer, obviously, Nikolai Gogol, wrote in Russian and was in fact a Russian patriot. All of this reflects the incredibly close ties between these two people who are now engaged in mutual slaughter, and that's what it is, in eastern Ukraine. Well, what then are the reasons for this conflict? And how did it all come about? The fact is that the paths pursued by Russia and Ukraine after the fall of the Soviet Union are remarkably similar in many respects. There was a common syndrome throughout the former Soviet Union, with the arguable exception of the Baltic republics. Because what the Soviet Union did and what communism did was to eliminate the sense of individual morality and individual moral judgment. Under these circumstances, what happened throughout the former Soviet Union was a massive transformation of economic structures in the absence of any attempt to repair the underlying moral damage that system had imposed. Well, under those circumstances, the economic change did not produce the needed or expected result. It was hoped, and it was widely theorized, that if the economy of a post-Soviet or a post-communist country was simply transformed from from being based on state ownership to being based on individual ownership, that automatically democratic processes would take, that market practices and democratic practices would take root. It failed to understand and to recognize really the wisdom of the definition of the market, which was advanced by Adam Smith, which is that the market, in essence, is equivalent exchange. You give me something, I give you something which is not identical, but in terms of value is equivalent. Thus, each of us trade on an equal basis. The only way to enforce such a complex, bearing in mind the complexity of modern and even pre-modern economic relations, such a fair trade could only be based on rules and, in effect, the rule of law. What took place in Russia was a massive transfer of private property, in Russia and in the former Soviet Union, a massive transfer of private property to individuals who then, in the absence of law, began to impose their terms on other owners. The result was widespread criminality, and those who were able to use the instruments of force most effectively were ultimately able to accumulate the greatest fortunes. This is a process that was not unique to Russia. It was repeated in Ukraine, and it was repeated in the other former Soviet republics, where everywhere you see the same tendency. You see a ruler taking power, surrounding himself by cronies and family members, stealing millions and billions of dollars from the national economy, and in order to defend his ill-gotten gain, creating the conditions to rule for life. In the case of Russia, there were limits on this process imposed by the bad health and physical frailty of Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin, by the late 1990s, was experiencing blackouts. He was incoherent. He oftentimes didn't know where he was, and he distanced himself from participation in the affairs of state and in the running of the economy. Even though in the years up until then, up until the late 1990s, he had been ruthless in eliminating any competitors for power. But in the case of Yeltsin, the aspiration, which is inherent in the system to rule for life, was replaced by a determination to put someone in power who could nonetheless guarantee the ill-gotten gains of those who had accumulated property without the benefit of law in Russia during the 1990s. And the person who appeared best suited to carry out that task was Vladimir Putin. Previously unknown, a person who had never run for office, had no political experience to speak of. His previous administrative experience of any note had been as the director of the FSB, the successor organization to the KGB. But that, in fact, proved to be an extremely good, valuable qualification, because the FSB, drawing on the experience of the KGB, was good, if at nothing else, it was good at provocations. I will not go into the details of how Putin became the president of Russia, replacing the enfeebled Yeltsin, who unbeknown to the Russian people in 1996 had suffered a massive heart attack and should not have been running for president at all, except to say that there is overwhelming evidence, which I've discussed in other places at other times, that terrorist acts which took place in 1999 in Russia, which united the Russian people behind a new war in Chechnya, and made Putin, who had a popularity rating of 2%, who was virtually unknown, into a national hero, as he posed as the defender of the Russian people against those who would attack innocent civilians and murder them in their own homes as they slept. The real evidence points not, in fact, to any terrorists originating in Chechnya or any place else as the authors of those bombings, but rather the FSB itself. But once Putin had succeeded Yeltsin and had given Yeltsin as his first official act the guarantee that he would be immune from prosecution, the same dynamic was put into play. Yeltsin was too sick to continue as president, but the new president who replaced him intended to rule for life, and we see in fact that if Yeltsin did not quite rule for life, the person he put in to protect him after he relinquished power certainly does intend to do so. The same process now was visible in Ukraine with Viktor Yanukovych. I spoke to a woman in Ukraine who said that if we don't get him out of here now, and this was at the time of Maidan, he said it won't be there'll be another term for Yanukovych, then a term for his son, then a second term for his son, then a term for his second son, and then a second term for his second son. We'll never get rid of him. And in fact, this was the intention, I'm sure, of the Yanukovych leadership. When Yanukovych came into power, there was, in effect, a democratic, semi-democratic majority in the Ukrainian parliament. But Yanukovych immediately began using the tax police in order to put pressure on those people who were in the Verkhovna Rada, and those who at least were in theory capable of independent decision-making. And one by one, those who had achieved positions as deputies, in order in the first instance, to guarantee their business interests, began to line up behind Yanukovych and the Party of the Regents, which was his ruling party. When a sufficient majority was achieved, they began the task of changing the Supreme Court and packing the Constitutional Court, which at that point made it possible to change the structure of the country, which once they had succeeded in doing so, they were able to change the structure of the country back from presidential parliamentary, which had been adopted after the Orange Revolution, back to presidential, through the elimination of the amendments which had made the original change possible. Under these circumstances, further judicial reforms greatly, I shouldn't use the word reform, but certain further changes made it possible for Yanukovych to impose his control over the legal system and once that control had been solidified, he began the process of creating his personal fortune and creating the fortunes of those who were connected to him and to his family. Now, what we saw in Russia as a result of privatization was the creation of huge fortunes in an impoverished country based on corrupt criminal connections. It was not possible. It was suggested during the 1990s that if you looked at every major fortune in Russia, somewhere you would find a magic hand that made it possible for a given person to receive the license to export oil, to receive the permission to hold government deposits in his or her bank, who was able to appropriate a major industry. It was impossible in almost all cases to know exactly who that person, who was the possessor of that magic hand, or how it came to be that the beneficiary, who gave every appearance of becoming a billionaire or millionaire by decree, was able to establish those connections. But under any circumstances, the benefits were simply incredible. Huge amounts of money, for example. Let's say the deposits of the Russian Customs Service were put in a bank, for example, the Onexim Bank of Vladimir Putin, and instead of those deposits being used for their intended purposes, being used, for example, to pay the government's bills, the officials of the banks invested them for their private purposes. The Russian public was not aware of the time value of money, and officials took advantage of that. Payments that should have been made immediately were withheld for 6 months, a year and a half. People went without their salaries. Many were driven to such desperation that they had to grow their own food. But while the country suffered under this burden, a small group was becoming very, very rich on the basis of their ability to access and manipulate government funds. That was the oligarchy that Putin, that Yeltsin created, that Putin protected, and that Putin had to deal with and found in power when he himself acceded to the presidency. Similar process took place in Ukraine. In Ukraine, an enormous factor was the ability to trade on gas, because Russian gas transited Ukraine. But there were other industrial enterprises which were taken over by oligarchs on the basis of corrupt ties, and nowhere more so than in the Donetsk Oblast, which in eastern Ukraine, which is now the center of the ongoing civil war. Now, the process of privatization in Russia, in Ukraine, was criminalized everywhere, but it was a case of open gangsterism in the Donetsk Oblast. And one of the persons who benefited from that was an oligarch by the name of Rinat Akhmetov, who achieved his position by, as a result, he was actually just one of the henchmen of an organized crime boss in Donetsk named Bragin, who died when his car was blown up along with 6 bodyguards under mysterious circumstances. Akhmetov then took over his empire. It's long been thought that Akhmetov was in fact complicit or one of the organizers of that killing. Akhmetov's political protege was Viktor Yanukovych, who actually had a criminal record. But this nonetheless, given the mores and the habits in eastern Ukraine, which is the Russian-speaking part of the country, did not prevent him from making a successful political career. And in any case, Yanukovych, as we know, ran for president of Ukraine in 2004 because of massive violations of the election rules and falsification. He was forced out in the Orange Revolution, but he won again in the next election in 2010. Once he was back in office, the methods of the Donetsk Oblast began to be applied in what was in effect a second round of expropriation and reprivatization. In Russia, this second round also took place, but it received particular impetus after the accession to power of Putin, due to the arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was a competitor for power in many respects, was the richest man in Russia, and whose successful and Western-oriented company, UKAS, the UKAS oil company, was expropriated after Khodorkovsky was jailed for 10 years, and its assets divided up among Putin's close cronies. That act, the UKAS case, the arrest of Khodorkovsky, basically initiated the new round of grabbing and re-privatizing. And it came under the heading of what is called in Russia raiding or raiderstvo. Now, as we know what a corporate raid is in the United States or in the West. Corporate raids take place all the time. They are carried out within a framework of law, and in the end, both sides benefit. Raiding in the Russian sense has nothing to do with corporate raiding and nothing in common with corporate raiding in the West. In Russia, corporate raiding, if earlier under Yeltsin and during the privatization period, people took over property with the help of contract murders, once in the post-Khodorkovsky era, the most common way of seizing someone's property was simply to get a false court decision against them. There were various ways of doing this. Oftentimes you filed in a court which was in a separate jurisdiction. You bribed local law enforcement in that jurisdiction, got an order, and then paid the local law enforcement in the area where the factory that you wanted to seize was located to go in and take it over. Those who were the targets for raiding were in many cases warned in advance, or at least made an offer. The offer was well below the market value of the asset in question. But the implication was clear that the next offer would be even lower. And there were many people who understood that it didn't pay to resist. Russia today is full. There are thousands of people in pre-trial detention in Russia today who are there at the behest of their competitors, because once the wave of raiding began in the wake of the Khodorkovsky case, it spread across the country and from the highest federal level to the local level. The process is actually very simple: suborning a judge and bribing law enforcement in order to take away someone's property. That's a mechanism that can be repeated anywhere, and it was repeated. The result being that thousands of businesses were taken over. Many of, in some those who resisted ended up with long jail sentences, or ended up being put in limbo in Russian pretrial detention under circumstances in which they waited for news of their fate for months or even years. And that process is continuing to this day. We now see the latest example of it in the case of the business empire of Yevtushenko, which is called Sistema. Now, Sistema had its own connections to organized crime, but in fact, it's clear that the arrest of Yevtushenko is connected definitely with the intention of those in power and persons close to Putin to take over one of the parts of, or all of, one of the largest holdings in Russia, and actually one of the most advanced in terms of its the quality of its enterprises. In Ukraine, the process developed a little bit differently. Yanukovych's son, Vladimir, is a 30-year-old dentist who also went into business. And he and his friends, with the help of law enforcement, which was now clearly in the hands of his father, began doing the same thing that had happened in Russia. They presented people with an offer that was significantly, for their businesses, that was significantly less than the market value, and made it clear that any failure to sell at that price would be met by the simple seizure of the enterprise with the help of law enforcement. And in a very short period of time, no more than 2 or 3 years, Yanukovych's son became a multi-billionaire, and those around him became really the largest, among the largest property owners, and certainly the largest and most powerful wielders of economic influence in the country. What again, as in Russia, what started at a high level was repeated at a local level. The example of the government appropriating people's businesses without due process of law, under threat, and with the help of a corrupt judicial system, was an example that was copied everywhere. And so the average person in Ukraine began to feel, and Ukraine, of course, is a much smaller country than Russia, began to feel that he was not safe in anything he did. One might think, well, this process wouldn't affect the owner of a small business necessarily, would it? But in fact it did. It created a climate of insecurity that affected virtually everyone. Yes, it's true, of course, that Yanukovych would not necessarily, Yanukovych and the people around Yanukovych would not necessarily have an interest in a small business that, somewhere in a provincial city. But persons who worked for persons who were loyal to Yanukovych and were connected to the party of the regions very well might have such an interest. And the system that made it possible for Yanukovych in Ukraine to accumulate in the course of a couple of years such an immense holding was a system that offered no protection for to the rights of anyone. And Ukraine also witnessed the same type of moral degradation that takes place in Russia. Frederick Douglass, in his autobiography, wrote that the mentality of a slave consists of the fact that he treats as absolutely normal conditions which are abnormal and against which he should revolt. And that, by that definition, there is something slavish in the behavior of people throughout the former Soviet Union, in Ukraine, in Russia, and it's demonstrated in the degree to which people feel that there's little they can do against the power of the state and against the power of its functionaries. There were two cases in Ukraine which brought this home, which had nothing to do with economics, but on the other hand reflected very precisely the moral condition of the society. Two women were attacked in two separate oblasts of Ukraine within the last 18 months. In one case, both women were raped. In one case, a woman involved was murdered. And what made these cases interesting was that the perpetrators in the one case, where the victim was murdered, were the police, and in the case where the woman was simply severely beaten and raped, were the children of the local party leaders, party being the party of the region. And this inspired a wave of indignation in Ukraine because it was so typical of the way in which this ruling criminal group behaves, the way it treats itself, the way its members drive, for example, leading to the deaths of pedestrians because of their recklessness. And all of this was building up in the attitudes of people who became more and more desperate over being subject to this kind of criminal power. Now, in Russia, there were demonstrations in 2011 and 2012 against the Putin regime. Those demonstrations were triggered by the falsification in the December 2011 parliamentary elections, which was very blatant, and by the announcement of Putin that he was running for office a third time, that Dmitry Medvedev, his supposed successor, was stepping down, and that Putin intended to run for a third term, which meant, in fact, he would also run for a fourth term. The presidential term under Medvedev having been increased from 4 years to 6 years, it presented the prospect that Putin would become president of Ukraine, would remain president of Ukraine, of Russia, forgive me, I'm getting, until 2024. Russians began to calculate how old they would be when he finally left office, if he ever left office. And it was this, plus the spectacle of the obviously falsified elections, the parliamentary elections, that led to demonstrations which eventually petered out. However, they may recrudesce. Time will tell. In Ukraine, the situation was slightly different. Because Ukraine is in some ways different from Russia. It shares the inheritance of the post-communist period, but there's some interesting aspects of Ukraine that make it more volatile politically than Russia. For one thing, the country's history, up until the beginning of the Second World War, or until, in fact, the end of the Second World War, Ukraine was not part of the Soviet Union. And Western Ukraine was part of Poland, and it was not part of the Russian Empire either. It was part of the Austrian Empire. Thus, different habits and different traditions existed in Western Ukraine than existed in Eastern Ukraine, and this also created the underlying conditions for political competition. But perhaps most important, Russia is not a candidate to join NATO or join the European Union. Ukraine is. And that means that Ukrainians have lived now, ever since the Orange Revolution, with the awareness of a possible alternative. They know the way they live, which is itself important. because Russia, because of its immense size and its isolation, is a country where many people don't really understand the way they live. But more important, in Ukraine, people also understand that there is such a thing as a Western alternative. It's been discussed now for more than a decade. And even though many Ukrainians may not know precisely what it would mean to join the European Union, or for Ukraine to be a member of NATO, the existence of such an alternative does exist in their minds and in their psychology. And that's why the events or rather the popular uprising in Russia that began in the aftermath of the falsification of the 2011 parliamentary elections and then fizzled out, in Ukraine did not fizzle out, and on the contrary achieved a scale sufficient to overthrow the Yanukovych government. Now, anytime, history is full of questions as to what would have happened had situation in certain respects been different. And it's certainly true in this case. On the one hand, you had long-standing resentment on the part of the population over the lawlessness and the corruption, over the fact that the police could do anything they wanted, that the government could do anything it wanted. But that in itself would not have been enough. Then you had the fact that the Yanukovych government had announced that it was going to sign an association agreement with the European Union. And at the last minute, without preparing the population in any way and neglecting the psychological importance for many Ukrainians of the idea that they were going to become part of the West, canceled without explanation that decision. But the third factor was something that was just a matter of chance. And that was the detonator that existed because a small group of students had gathered in the Maidan square in order actually to encourage the Yanukovych government to persist in the European choice. And when, after it was announced that there would be no association agreement with the European Union, they refused to leave and they were attacked by riot police and beaten savagely. That had not happened in Ukraine before, and the population reacted with a massive demonstration of protest. That combination of events gave birth to a movement which was popular, that was self-organizing, that was in essence peaceful, that was principled, despite the fact that many right-wing extremists and national extremists attached themselves to the Maidan cause. The fact is that the overwhelming majority of people who were there in the square and who were demanding the ouster of Yanukovych did it on anti-criminal grounds, and not because of of right-wing sentiments. Even though it is true that the right-wing and nationalist groups did everything possible to make themselves visible, which was a boon for Russian propaganda, by the way. And in the end, as a result of their determination and their refusal to be intimidated by the use of force, when the Yanukovych government authorized the attack on the demonstrators by snipers, it became clear that, in fact, the people of Ukraine had won, and this government, which was in fact a parasitical collection of exploiters, whose interests had nothing to do with the population, had lost. But this development could hardly have been viewed from Moscow with equanimity. Because during the years that Putin has been in power, beginning with the closing down of the independent television station, NTV, and continuing with the abolishment of the elections of governors, with the arrest of Khodorkovsky, and the intimidation of the oligarchs, who from that point on were obliged to use their fortunes solely in furtherance of the political ambition and preferences of the Putin regime, had eliminated the ability of, has steadily eliminated the ability of society to exercise any power over the government. Even if it is true, and I believe it is true, that the Putin government, the Putin regime, for reasons that have a lot to do with the prosperity of Russia in the 2000s, still commands a certain degree of popular support. Despite this fact, the trends in Russia are such as to make it impossible in the long run for Putin to realize the goal of all post-Soviet leaders, which is to rule for life. The regime that was created in order to perpetuate the hold on power of this small group of people stifles initiative, discourages investment, and forces the most creative and talented people into exile. It is showing signs of running down economically. It is losing its despite the nationalist and chauvinist euphoria created by the attack on Ukraine, it is globally losing credibility, and it will continue to do so. Russians are well aware that Putin intends to run for a fourth term in office and are opposed to that, even if they support him now. And under these circumstances, the spectacle of what went on in Ukraine, which is a standing example to the Russian people of the way in which, despite the monopolization of power by the authorities, it's possible to displace and overthrow a criminal regime, was unacceptable. And it was for that reason, among others, that Russia's long-standing struggle to appear to be normal when it is in fact abnormal became too much, and Russia and the Putin regime are revealing themselves for what they are. We talked about, and I mentioned briefly, the apartment bombings, and one of the great defenses of the Putin regime and its ability to avoid responsibility and avoid a serious consideration of the evidence that it's culpable in such a mass crime against its own people is the fact that it's impossible to believe that anyone would do that anyone would be willing to blow up their own citizens in order to seize power. But who would believe that in the interest of holding on to power, a regime would start a civil war between two so closely related peoples as Russians and Ukrainians? And whatever Russian propaganda may say, there is absolutely no persecution of Russian speakers in Ukraine. Kiev itself is a Russian-speaking citizen, and the Russians who are fighting for the most part in eastern Ukraine are not local inhabitants, but mercenaries pouring in from over the border. from across the border. It is true that in any nationalist conflict, there are always fault lines between peoples who have lived together for many years, different national groups, and who get along perfectly well until the point is reached where someone has a motive for turning them against each other. And that's what happened in this case. And that is the reason why not only the fighting has taken such a has been carried out on such a wide scale, but that it's been so vicious. We already have there are horrible accounts of atrocities being committed against people who are very, very similar, young guys who are in fact have virtually the same backgrounds. And all of this is done in order to distract the attention of the Russian people from the very relevant Ukrainian example, an example that can point the way to their own better future. Now, we know that the Ukrainian armed forces were not able, although they were able to contain the separatists, they were not able to fight effectively against trained Russian units that were brought in a counterattack after they began to narrow the circle around Lugansk and Donetsk. But as a result, there is now a tenuous ceasefire, which may be broken at any time, and under any circumstances will allow Russia to destabilize the situation in Ukraine under conditions of its own choosing. But I don't think that that the Russian leadership will achieve its objectives as a result of inspiring a civil war in Ukraine. On the contrary, I think a process has been set into motion that will, in time, destabilize Russia. For one thing, it is now becoming, many of the soldiers who fought in Ukraine were not aware that they were being sent there to fight against Ukrainians. They were told they were being sent there to take part in training exercises, and only to be slaughtered. This is very similar to what happened during the first days and weeks of the war in Chechnya. At the same time, the Russian government is trying to conceal the burials of Russian soldiers so that the population is unaware of how many people have died in eastern Ukraine. But as the death toll mounts, and as people become more aware, they will begin to think. Anyone looking at Russia at the present time might be forgiven for wondering if they will ever learn to think, because the country has really been swept by nationalist hysteria. But after a binge, there's a period of sobering up, and the Russians will begin to put two and two together and to understand in whose interest it was that this war be started and carried out as it is. And under these circumstances, other things will begin to have an effect. We know perfectly well that the Russians, when the sanctions were announced, tried to laugh them off. They said, well, okay, we can't have Western products, we'll cook blinis and borscht, and it doesn't matter compared to what we've dealt with in the past. But those sanctions will, especially if they're toughened, are already having multiplier effects. They're discouraging investment, and they're encouraging those people in the ruling elite group in Russia to make plans to leave the country. This is the most unpatriotic and disloyal elite that Russia has ever had. These are people who have dual passports. They have their wives, children, mistresses, everything outside the country. Their interest in Russia is to rob it and pillage it, and they have escape plans. In this unstable situation, the more the more aggressive that Putin becomes, the more aggressively the regime tries to use a patriotic and chauvinistic hysteria to mask its abuse of power, the sooner it will hit up against the natural limit of its ability to do so. And once that happens, and once attitudes begin to change in Russia, there will be a real danger for the regime. There will be a real incentive for the society to organize itself in the same way the Ukrainian society organized itself. And it doesn't have to do it on the scale of the whole country. It needs to do it only in Moscow. And the regime will be threatened. And for this reason, I think that the Russia's actions in Ukraine, far from saving the regime, only hastened the eventual systemic crisis that faces the country. And it is this that Americans need to be aware of, because Russia's a very powerful country with nuclear weapons, and worldwide, it doesn't have the worldwide influence of the Soviet Union, but it has the ability to make its presence felt, certainly on its periphery, and it's a big periphery. So I feel that, in a sense, we need to value what the Ukrainian people have done. We need to study it. We have to try to reach out as best we can to the Russian people, and try to make the point, both for ourselves and for others, that really what happened in Ukraine was in Russia's own interest, because the regime that existed in Ukraine and the regime that exists in Russia these are dead ends. These are historical dead ends, and Russia's future depends on finding a different way, just as Ukraine and the Ukrainian people sought to do in the Maidan. Well, thank you very much. And I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Because our event is being recorded, we ask that you state your name and affiliation prior to stating your question.
Yes, please.
So my name is Tyler Defbach. I'm an intern with IWP. My question pertains to the Budapest Memorandum. Do you think that if Ukraine had kept its nuclear weapons, do you think this whole, I don't know what you want to call it, conflict, whatever, could have been avoided?
I'm not sure that nuclear weapons would have been relevant in the existing conflict, because it wasn't. And I don't think that nuclear weapons are necessarily relevant in every situation. I'm not a nuclear strategist, of course, but they had people pouring in over the border who claimed to be. I think the real problem was that Ukraine didn't have effective armed forces and conventional units. The point, though, about the Budapest Memorandum is that it placed a moral obligation on the Western countries which sponsored it to give Ukraine every support under conditions in which it's threatened, insofar as Ukraine was willing to ship its weapons to Russia in the interest of world security. So therefore, the world, in relation to Ukraine, should take some responsibility for its security. Yes, please, in the far back.
Robert Simmons, I'm a Foreign Service Officer. Two quick questions, folks. Do you think the Russian government has any legitimate concern with the anti-missile treaty and the possibility of Ukraine having NATO forces there, in essence, around Russia, give the U.S. or NATO the opportunity to travel right into Russia in the event there is such a conflict? And secondly, in terms of sanctions, Western Europe is a very large market for Russia.
I'm sorry, what was the second about the second?
The second question is in terms of how valid do you think these sanctions would be enforced with Western European companies' pride and concern because of the impact it has on the exports into the Russian market. And thirdly, energy. Energy is incredibly important. And how would that all play into play with the Ukraine market in dire need of energy resources as well as in Western Europe?
Well, as far as let's take the first question first. The anti-missile batteries that were, even without Ukraine, the original idea was to put anti-missile installations in Poland and Czech Republic. This was long before we had this Ukrainian. The Russian ICBM fleet, the Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles, are aimed to travel over the North Pole. They don't. They would not be stopped by anti-missile rockets that are placed, south of Russia, or even east, or rather west. But the other question is mentality, really. Russia's own experts pointed out that the anti-missile systems that the United States was preparing to install were purely defensive and directed toward a threat emanating from a different part of the world. And their geographical placement made that clear. Also, the technology being used made that clear. But I think what the Russians were worried about was that they could be adapted to stop Russian tactical missiles, which are tactical nuclear weapons, which were launched with the help of short-range missiles, and those are useful for intimidating Russia's neighbors. So it wasn't really a question of them worrying about the effectiveness of their ICBMs, which are not going to be affected in any case because they're positioned differently, they're different speed, and they're aimed differently. And they can't be caught by those missiles, but rather but they were concerned that perhaps an instrument of pressure that they had over countries like Lithuania and Poland might be compromised. The other thing is, of course, that they wanted to create, for the benefit of the Russian public, the idea that they were being threatened. I mean, most people are not that well equipped to engage in detailed discussion of missile trajectories. Now you had two other questions. One was the sanctions. What was it about the sanctions you were saying?
How valid do you think they would be enforced with Western Europe such as
How are they likely to be enforced? Well, we can hope they'll be enforced seriously. I mean, they're already being enforced, and I can tell you that inside Russia, they're being, every business discussion begins and ends with a discussion of the sanctions, which is itself an important factor because it's also part of the whole goal is psychological, to make it clear that annexing other countries is not going to be tolerated. That when you do that, you're doing something wrong. And what was the third?
oil, energy?
Well, Russia needs to sell its oil and gas as much as the West needs to consume it. So time will tell how that plays out. I mean, the sanctions don't target the trade in oil and gas; they target investment in oil and gas. That's a different thing. So that Russia's is going to start not getting the sophisticated equipment it needs for exploring in remote areas and exploiting actually very large oil and gas deposits. Doesn't mean that they're going to stop exporting tomorrow or that we're going to stop buying that gas. But if they do, I mean, if they stop exporting, what are they going to do with it? They need that revenue. Yeah, please.
Barry Wood, I'm an economics columnist. David, that's a very persuasive presentation. However, I'd like to just present what Beth Pond has been writing from Berlin, which is that Poroshenko is playing for the very weak hand. It's likely that the country will remain fragmented, dysfunctional, and that while you make a long-term program that is persuasive, isn't it more likely that the Europeans will eventually lift the sanctions, or lift most of them, and that the Ukraine-Russia conflict will become frozen?
Though that's entirely possible. It's entirely possible. But once again, it's very, the West is not good at sticking to a policy. And as we know, but if we were to, if the United States in particular were to make its policies, make its decisions on the basis of the fact that down the road we're likely to abandon it, I mean, we wouldn't even do what we do now. So I think that, and we don't know what it'll set in motion, you know? People live in the here and now, and the sanctions will affect the calculations of Russia, at least in the near term, and cause them to take decisions, and cause the Russian people to make adjustments and take decisions that could affect the evolution of events in a positive direction. In any case, there's really little alternative, because not to sanction this kind of behavior is to invite Russia to repeat it in other areas, including in countries which are NATO members, and where their aggression would bring them into direct conflict with the U.S. Yeah, please.
Yes, obviously, Dr. Shushko, Chair of Polish Studies at the Institute here. Short and quick question. How do you assess the Obama administration's current response or policy to Russian aggression towards Ukraine?
How do I assess the Obama administration response? Well, I mean, it's always possible. I think in this instance, it hasn't been that bad. I mean, they've. I think that I don't like the idea of gradually increasing the pressure when it comes to sanctions. I think that once it's clear that you've got a case of unambiguous aggression, that you need to impose maximum sanctions, and then let the person that's being sanctioned worry about getting out from under those sanctions. But with that proviso, I think they've done what they had to do, and they're continuing to do so, may do more. So I don't think that this is a particular case. Now, the reset policy which preceded it all, and may have encouraged Russia to think that they can get away with things like that, that's an entirely different matter, because that was a policy based on a totally unrealistic view of Russia and of the nature of Russia. But since that time, Russia has made clear its true nature, and so even the most naive and trusting and uninformed could not fail to get the message. Yes, please.
Nishant Fenn, I'm an undergraduate student at George Mason University. You seem to portray Vladimir Putin as more of an oligarch and more of an individualist opportunist, instead of what he's trying to portray himself as a nationalist who's trying to bring back the glory of the Soviet Union. So then, would you say that he isn't actually looking to bring back glory of Russia? He doesn't have Russia's best interests at heart, but instead looking to further his own personal agenda and just use the stature that he would have as president of Russia to bring himself more wealth and be like one of these oligarchs who's just planning to suck Russia dry of any sort of riches or resources?
Well, I would put it this way. I don't think that there's an altruistic motive. I don't think that it's that there's any, that he's some kind of great thinker, or that he is a theoretician. I mean, all of what he has come up with the nationalist rhetoric that he's employing is convenient for justifying and rationalizing his crimes and the pillaging of the country. Would a true nationalist be interested in this type of pillage? That's also an interesting question. So I think it's really purely artificial. Kurt, do you want to?
Yeah, Kurt Windsor, Donner Foundation. We had an interesting symposium at Hudson this morning in which they were talking about the Russia Mir idea, the notion of that and of hybrid military applications, but that Putin had developed a mythology almost of not a greater Soviet Union, but of reaching out as the Germans did in the Sudetenland to the Russian-speaking peoples, whether they be presently pro-Russian or not, and that this has become his justification, as you would put it, for the crimes or whatever he's committing. Is this anything new, or?
Well, this was always in potential. This was mentioned by Yeltsin, the idea that
The Baltics.
that we have the duty to defend our because they can't think of anything else. And I always get I always get a kick out of this defending Russian speakers because, by the way, I'm a Russian speaker, and the last thing I would want is the Russian regime to defend me.
We know how they love you, David.
What?
We know how they love you.
Yeah, I know. They don't even give me a visa, and now they're trying to claim they're going to defend Russian speakers. So I don't know, but. It's of course, the intellect, say what you will about Marxism, Leninism. It was a highly sophisticated system, theoretical system. And it was persuasive. And many of the people who were persuaded by it were not fools. Which is testified by the fact that many of the anti-communists who fought against the Soviet Union, I mean, were people at one time and another, like Alain Besançon, Robert Conquest, various other people, earlier were communists, Arthur Kessler, Ignacio Saloni. I point this out because Marxism, Leninism was something that a person could be persuaded by, and people were persuaded. Nobody's going to be persuaded by this. Nobody who doesn't have, the idea that Russia has a duty to defend Russian speakers and who are under no threat whatsoever. This is the gossamer thin justification being used by a collection of thieves. Really, this is not. You could even consider. In my view, this isn't even a government. It's more like it's a gang with a foreign policy, and
they call it hybrid. They call it a hybrid approach: military, political, economic, social.
Well, there's always in any conflict, of course, in any conflict, the ability to. To conceptualize your goals, to explain, and to rally support behind them is extremely important. And that applies not just to, we know the incredible power of ideology when it comes to military success. It was demonstrated during the French Revolution. The French, when revolutionary France was unstoppable, and Douglas MacArthur was astounded at the difference in the fighting ability of the Chinese. He witnessed the Chinese nationalists and how they fought. But in Korea, when he saw the Chinese communists and how they fought, he saw the difference was night and day. Because these ideologies turn people into robots, and a robot is fearless. And that is what, of course, the reason why the Russians, of all people, would not neglect the importance of ideology. The problem is they're stuck with something that's totally unconvincing and and which they can barely articulate themselves. Bert?
Your response on the question about how the president has handled his relationship with Russia made sense to me. I wonder how you can comment, or what you would comment on the questions or the positions raised by Matlock and Pickering and others, that the United States is moving too hard against Russia, that the United States and the NATO countries are responsible for the movement of NATO east in violation of a Baker agreement, that Russia is responding to that kind of aggressive position of the West.
Well, you know, it's they're responding very aggressively, aren't they, to this aggressive position of the West. I worked as you know, because we were there together. I worked in the Soviet Union, and the Russians never did anything aggressive. They were always responding to the aggression of anyone. I mean, and in fact, every act of aggression was actually an act of idealism. And they were trying to save the Hungarians from counter-revolution, saving the Czechs from counter-revolution, saving the Afghans from an attack by foreign power, which when they were the only foreign power attacking, but was beyond this. So they never do anything wrong, you see. And when I used to go, and there's other people in this room who also had this experience, we'd go to the Institute of the USA in Canada. They would say that NATO is getting these very aggressive anti-tank weapons. I said, well, you have 30,000 tanks. You expect them to get. It reminds me, actually, I'll tell you a story. I shouldn't do this in a serious, since this is a serious gathering, but for maybe some comic relief. There was a friend of mine who worked in, who I knew in Moscow, and he had he was fairly well off in the Soviet times. There was this old lady who had lived under the Tsars. This was back in the 1980s. She was still alive, and she was cleaning up, in his apartment. And he used to question her about what life was like under the Tsar. And he asked her, he said, well, did people have enough to eat under the Tsar? And she said, oh yes, we had lots to eat. I mean, there was just, meat and bread and eggs and everything, anything as much as you'd want. And I said, well, but did people have nice places to live? Oh yeah, it was wonderful. Everyone had their own place, not in communal apartments. And and I said, well, Granny, was it better under the Tsar? And she stopped and she says, oh no, it's better now. He says, well, if we had more food under the Tsar and we had better living conditions, why is it better now? He says, you see, now the Americans surround us with their bases. And he said he looked at her and he said, and she was a very simple woman. He said for the first time he thought he saw this cunning gleam in her eye. So, the Russians are, what communism did was it turned Russia into a nation of actors. And no performance is more common than the one that you're threatening us, and that's why we're building up this huge military machine. And as for Jack Matlock and others who accept this logic, well, you believe it if you like. To me, it seemed always absolutely ridiculous. And completely at variance with the nature of the society and the nature of their behavior. But people believe different things. I mean, up to a point, if you want to believe that and you find that convincing, I just don't know, where we go from there.
Moral equivalence.
Yeah, I mean, Jeff.
Jeffrey Scott Shapiro, Washington Times. David, do you feel like there's any potential rising challenger in Russia right now that has the charisma and the personality that the Russian people know about and they're talking about, who could become a formidable challenger to Vladimir Putin or the United Russia regime?
Gee, you know, I don't, I'll tell you, and I don't, and my guess is that such a challenger would emerge in the process the problem with a lot of the leaders now is they've been around for a long time. Some of them were associated with Yeltsin in the 90s, and I'm just not sure. My guess is that someone who's not known now would be, or at least not well known. And yes, please.
There's that recent threat in Hillary. I was wondering if you thought that Khodorkovsky would be.
That's a very interesting question. You know, in fact, you know, he's were it not for the fact that people will have a hard time forgiving anyone who made such huge amounts of money during the 90s. If he had just been in jail, he would be perfect. So I'm not sure about that, but he could have a critical role in helping someone. Yes, please.
Bodin Contour, individual researcher. You mentioned that individual moral judgment was eliminated during the Soviet era. Are there any institutions in Russia and Ukraine that would bring back individual conscious and accountable actions? I mean, there's the Orthodox Church, there's sports clubs that are aligned with
Not the sports clubs.
Yeah, I'm just throwing.
I don't know about institutions. There are plenty of people, though. There are individuals. There are a lot of individuals who, and that's you know, it's the spoken and written word that counts at this point. The Orthodox Church is, you have to distinguish between the church hierarchy, which is corrupted, and the ordinary priests. Ordinary priests do help people, you know, but they are very unworldly, in many cases, whereas the hierarchy of the church is terribly corrupt. So I don't think it's a matter of institutions, but it's a matter of kind of revivifying the atmosphere so that the country becomes receptive to moral ideas. It's always been receptive, actually. But I mean, it's part of the failure, in a way, of the United States that we've not, and of the West, that we've not been able to bring home to a potentially receptive audience what the moral and ethical stakes are. And maybe that says something about us. But you know, the power of the spoken and written word under these circumstances may be much more important than the activities of institutions.
Well, with the written word being censored more and more, and
it's not censored
the
entirely.
watchdog organizations? You know, there's human rights organizations, there's environmental groups.
Well, there's Memorial,
writing?
the Memorial Society in Moscow, which attempts to preserve the historical record. I mean, now, that's an organization, but what it's doing is, in fact, protecting the word, protecting historical truth. In my latest book, I worked a lot with the Memorial Society. You know, moral influence, to the extent that we can wield such influence, could have a very positive effect in Russia. But we can't even talk in those terms if we have policies like Reset, which reflect the fact that we don't understand that there's a problem there. We had things like the McFall-Surkoff Commission on Civil Society. Well, Vladislav Surkov, the guy who was the Russian representative, has devoted his whole life to basically to eliminating civil society. So what are we discussing here? You know, this type of thing. Anybody else? Kurt, you up?
One question that has come up, and that apparently a book is going to be coming out on shortly, is the extent to which Putin may be less, not just FSB and KGB, but that he was basically what the Russians would call a hooligan, a gangster, before he got into the KGB, and that this is very much a part of his mentality. Is this something that you're aware of or have looked at?
Well, I know Karen DeWees's book. In fact, she's presenting it right now at the Kennan Institute, and I couldn't be there because I had to be here. I'm glad to be here, but I would have if I wasn't here. I would be there. I know her, but the fact is, I don't put actually too much stock in that. I think that the Soviet system produced millions of people like Putin, and in fact, there's nothing unique about him. I think that he, if it hadn't been him, somebody else would have been put in that position with no moral, principles, and would have done exactly the same thing. So I think it's what happened to a society. I mean, to get into a very philosophical question, but briefly, when you absolutize political goals, as happened under communism, you eliminate individual moral judgment. That was a situation that lasted for 4 generations. At that time, it's enough really to condition people to think, not to think in terms of a source of legitimacy for their actions. And then just to grab anything you can. And then Putin embodies that. He's not a big intellect by any means. Although people say he's got a good memory. But this is, somebody else in that position would have done the same. Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan does the same. Yanukovych in Ukraine does the same. Yeltsin actually, despite all the romanticism about him, basically did the same. It's standard behavior. As soon as they get into a situation where they can steal, they steal, because they don't recognize that there's any reason not to steal. And that's the tragedy of the country.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, well, wait, yes, in the back, this young lady.
My question, unrelated, my question is about these nascent signs of desovietization.
I'm sorry, tell us.
The nascent signs of desovietization,
Yeah.
The wave of Lenin statues that have come down, including Kharkiv 2 days ago, which is the heavily Russified eastern Ukraine, where the forced famine took place by Stalin in the 1930s. So even there, they are taking down Lenin statues. And then also, in recent days, I read about a Romanian man that is the first communist, major communist, to be being put on trial, and they're calling it the Nuremberg type of process for communism.
Well, in Romania.
In Romania.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that what's happening in Ukraine with the statues being torn down is just that's just one of the ways in which the political conflict is being played out. That happened in Kiev. That happened elsewhere. I mean, there was a wave of statues that were torn down during the after the Soviet Union fell, or even during Perestroika. And those that stayed up in areas where there were large numbers of communist sympathizers. And now the political balance has turned against those people, so those statues are being torn down. I wouldn't I wouldn't attribute too much deeper meaning to that. I guess that's it. Well, thanks. Listen, thank you all for coming.